Good afternoon to everybody, and welcome to this platform of the Emancipatory Future Studies Project and the Democratic Marxism series. The Emancipatory Future Studies project has been running now for about 6 years, and it's all about exploring, if you like, subaltern world making from below. We've worked with an approach to climate temporalities, we've worked with decolonial futures, systemic pathways into the future, grand ecocentric futures. We basically have a polyepistemological approach to this, drawing on critical theory, including Marxism. And so today's guest, who I'll say more about just now, will kind of take us down a path around how Marxism in the everyday and the phenomenological experience can help us think more deeply. The Democratic Marxism series has been around for over 12 years, and it's essentially about defending a Marxist project. Basically, it's a post-vanguardist kind of platform, and it's been thinking through Marxism conjuncturally for our times, and very much trying to reconstruct it in dialogue with other forms of anti-capitalism. So today's topic, as I said, is grounding critique, Marxism, concept formation, and embodied social relations. Our guest is Gökbörü Sarp Tanyildiz, teaches in the Department of Sociology at Brock University, Canada. His research focuses on concept formation in social and spatial theories of Marxism, racial capitalism, and social reproduction. As a methodologist of social sciences and humanities, he explores the political possibilities that phenomenological Marxism might offer to understand contemporary embodied social relations under capitalism. Thank you so much, Gökbörü, for joining us this afternoon in South Africa. I think your morning in Canada. And so the platform is yours. Over to you.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Vish, for having me, and thank you to Sam, Joe, Charles for making the logistics and everything possible. I'm really, really happy to be here, and I'll talk about my new book called Grounding Critique. It's a very textual project, so before the text, I want to speak a little bit about the context. And let me, in the meantime, share the PowerPoint. Okay. So I think what was important for me is that when I started, I feel like the political economic part of Marxism has been quite advanced in trying to understand social relations, especially in particular the social relation of class. But when it came to understanding embodied social relations, such as gender, race, sexuality, ability, we are not perhaps making use of the full potential of Marxist thought and Marxism in general. So it really started with a sense of this lack, wanting to see what possibilities Marx, his thought, Marxism offers us in order to understand these. But this was, of course, also happening within the context of a global far-right ascendancy. And for us, in the last year and more, happening in the context of genocide in Palestine, it is happening in the context of growing fascism, proto-fascism in certainly North America, but globally as well. And of course, when this was happening, the concepts that we are using becoming a lot more important, as I understand it, especially on our campuses, and the again far-right assaults on our curriculum, thinking about emancipatory futures. And this was really the impetus of this project for me. And what I thought is that, and I do see Marxism as or us needing a Marxism rather, a Marxism made to the measure of life. And of course, in saying that, I'm referring to MSSR's humanism, made to the measure of the world. And I feel like Marxism that is capable of explaining life is possible, not out of some sort of dogmatic belief or concern, but rather with the knowledge that I feel like it is Marxism that gives us an understanding of the everyday, subjective, sensuous human process without historicism, sociologism, or subjectivism. And because it really is our task, probably, to understand the relationship between the history and the human being in mediation of society. And I feel like Marxism really is probably one of the more helpful theoretical frameworks and proxial frameworks to understand that. And today, when I was thinking about democratic Marxism and emancipatory futures, I actually wanted to start with this idea and turning to Bakhtin and thinking about what Marxist social theory is for. And for me, it is really about understanding the human being as the most important question of Marxist social relations, that is the conceptualizing of human beings. And in this project, I argue that a Marxist understanding of embodied social relations cannot be satisfied with conceptualizing human beings, neither as the universal self-same subject, as in liberalism, nor as the embodiment of a multitude of particular identities, as in intersectionality, nor as the differentiated instantiations of a unitarian totality, as in social reproduction theory. So I suggest that Bakhtin's following reminders must be kept in mind in any attempt to construct a Marxist social theory examining embodied social relations. That is, and I quote, an individual cannot be completely incarnated into the flesh of existing socio-historical categories. There always remains an unrealized surplus of humanness. There always remains a need for future. A place for this future must be found, says Bakhtin. And finally, that a person never coincides with themselves. One cannot apply to them the formula of identity, A equals A. The genuine life of the personality takes place at the point of non-coincidence between the person and themselves. And this is the point I'm trying to understand with this project. And this project is the first book in a series of 3 books on phenomenological Marxism. In this one, I turn to intersectionality and Marxism in order to do a bit of what I call the conceptual ground clearing, to see how the existing Marxist frameworks are conceptualizing embodied social relations and what are perhaps the unexplored possibilities and limitations in these ways of thinking, so that in the second and third volume, I can turn to the lost tradition of phenomenological Marxism, first recover it, and then in a third volume, apply it to various social phenomena. So how I go about this is that I basically take the critiques of Marxist, and in particular Marxist feminist critiques of intersectionality, as a moment of congealment in our understanding of Marxist concepts. In other words, how do Marxist feminists are using various Marxist concepts in order to critique intersectionality, for me reveals the ways in which we are thinking about race, gender, and sexuality. And I feel like that is my starting point for that project. And I should clarify, because there is often a lot of confusion about what social relations are. We keep thinking and hearing about such and such is not a thing, it's a social relation, but rarely do we take the time to think about what a social relation is. Of course, the social relation, speaking technically, is the interconnectedness of social action. But I'm not looking at a more Weberian understanding of social relations in that regard, but rather I'm asking the question, how is society possible? Or, especially for this project, how is an intersectional society possible? Why is it that we keep thinking these terms about race, gender, sexuality in order to understand the fact of our society in this moment in history? And for that, I'm using this very particular concept of embodied social relations that is right now on the screen, which is that there are those social relations that contribute to the constitution of society through the social and spatial organization of bodies. So embodied social relations are those that, in the making of history, organize the subject's passage between the individual and the collective, as well as the particular and universal. Because remember, my concern is understanding that relationship between history and the human subject as such, as the maker of that history. And they are the modes, these social embodied social relations are the modes through which subjects experience, express, contest, change their own sensuous human practical activity with possibilities and restrictions alike. So therefore, embodied social relations are historically contingent and sedimented, subjectively transitory and affecting, and socially operant and involuntary. So what I did, therefore, is that I looked at in particular a special issue of society, science and society, um, a special issue that is dedicated to the critiques of intersectionality by prominent contemporary Marxist feminists such as Esther Eisenstein, Barbara Foley, Marta Jimenez, Lise Vogel. So what I found is that contemporary Marxist feminism, in particular these four authors, but I do refer to a range of different thinkers, their critique usually operates through a set of conceptual binaries. And in my exposition in the book, I found that they explore the following thematic binaries: the base versus the superstructure. We still seem to be falling back on it in order to understand the relationship between class and these other embodied social relations. Mode of production versus social formation, class as structuration versus class as culture, critical Marxist epistemology versus sociology of knowledge, theory versus practice, understanding versus action, and the nomothetic versus ideographic. So what I say is that contemporary Marxist feminism seems to create, by using these conceptual binaries, they seem to create a diremption between history, society, and subject, rather than looking at the relationship between them. And in this scheme, history becomes knowable through the concept of mode of production, whereas society through social formation and embodied social relations through ideology. And thus, contemporary Marxist feminist thought seems to dissolve intersecting lines in favor of parallel planes that are bereft of social existence and life. And to connect these planes, they seem to summon a Marxist class politics. However, I show that this moves actually stymies the real political possibilities and reach of Marxist politics, because it comes in as a rescue mission rather than organically developing from its own premises and presuppositions. Moreover, it does not solve the conceptual problems that these diremptions produce in the first place, because these problems belong not to Marxist social thought, but to the antinomies of classical reason, classical sociological reason, which I in the book trace back to its neo-Kantian origins. And I'm happy to talk more about it during the Q&A. So the second attempt to understand perhaps the most cutting edge right now in our contemporary moment in Marxist social theory is the social reproduction theory. And social reproduction theory, I should be clear, I don't mean social reproduction feminisms. That goes back to the Italian, German, Canadian variants of it. But I'm specifically talking about the version that really restarted with the republication of Lise Vogel's book, Marxism and the Oppression of Women, in 2013, which was originally published in 1983. And what we witnessed in this last decade is that this very important concept of social reproduction turned into a theory. So I'm trying to analyze, how do we move from a concept to theory, and what are the possibilities and limitations of this passage from a concept to the theory. So therefore, I analyzed the following themes in social reproduction theory that are the specific analytical moves through which SRT attempts to remedy the structuralist and functionalist accounts of embodied social relations in earlier social reproduction analyses. The ontological, epistemological, and methodological propositions of its Unitarian structure, and SRT's constant separation between method and system in various bodies of thought, including Hegelian Marxism and intersectionality, and SRT's conflation between ontology and politics as a way of issuing validity for its knowledge claims, and the steps it takes to effect a dialectical overcoming of intersectionality. What I argue in relation to social reproduction theory is that it cannot validly or soundly argued to be a social theory because its concept formation and its selection and articulation of social problems do not methodologically integrate embodied social relations, especially race and racialization, into the theory's analytical framework, but rather they import embodied social relations from intersectionality without undertaking the necessary conceptual labor, which I show is a big problem in the constitution of this new theory. And therefore, while it recognizes the existence of these relations and systems of oppression, it does not produce an account of these relations through which human practical activity and their genuine contradictions may be grasped. That, I said, is really the, I think, first and foremost, the most important task of Marxist theory for our time. But does it mean that I suggest kind of doing away with this concept of social reproduction? Absolutely not, because concepts are the congealments of social relations of our times, and I believe that we don't get to just pick willy-nilly the concepts that we are using, but rather we are working through them. So instead of suggesting that we should do away with this concept, what I'm asking is that if we were to reconceptualize, reconfigure social reproduction, where might it take us? So I say that, therefore, what I try to do in the book is really trying to discover a saturated discernment of the ways in which the gap between the conceptual practices effected within a reconstructed Marxist symbolic universe, that is for me SRT, and the lived social world of sensuous human praxis, that which we need to understand. And I feel like covering over this gap results in a methodological circuit between infinite regress and ever-expanding tautology. And these are the two methodological problems that I identify. And therefore, in not being able to anchor to questions of social reproduction of labor power in a discussion of the possibility of society, the nature of the social, the principle of sociability, the forms of association. As a result, the initial conceptual question of if labor produces capitalist value, then what reproduces labor power, comes to be a flat cartographical surface on which the sites and bodies and activities involved in social reproduction are grafted. This surface merely demonstrates the extent of the economic subsumption of life under contemporary capitalism. However, because this demonstration is achieved in social reproduction theory through the nomothetised facticity of social relations, it is really unable to engage with the lived social world. Rather, it turns this lived social world into a unitarian representation of the symbolic universe that SRT creates, which happens to be really the definition of ideology Marx and Engels uses in the German ideology. But then I ask, what happens if we did not work with a notion of life as produced by social reproduction, thereby not relying on a chain of infinite regression? What if we were not to allow social reproduction structures of intentionality directed at the production of labor power to expand to all of life? What if we divested from taking it for granted that the worker shows up at their workplace every day with their labor power is reproduced? What if we began entertaining that the capitalist actually exploits what the laborer does not have, thus reproducing their non-being daily? And what if we focused on the struggle between the workers' production of their being and non-being as depending on the social relations in which they stand? So in short, I'm asking, what if we use the concept of social reproduction as a method rather than a theory that helps us understand how capitalist life is lived and how it is lived differently in its collective constitution by subjective human praxis? Then where would social reproduction go? Where would it take us? So my response for that is that it would probably take us to, or one of the places at least, that it could take us to a consideration of social reproduction qua method. And of course, by method, I am using method perhaps in an etymologically loyal way, in that it refers to the manner in which a study of concept formation traverses back and forth between the gap I identified above, that is between the symbolic theoretical universe and the lived social relation. Therefore, rather than operationalized as life-making, whereby social reproduction superimposes the symbolic universe of theory on lived social world in order to create a unitary system of explanation, social reproduction qua method marks neither the intersection nor the union between these sets of ideal objects of knowledge and real objects of knowledge. Instead, it fixes its analytical attention on the relative and absolute complements between these two sets of objects of knowledge. In other words, social reproduction qua method navigates the gap between and outside them. This traversing back and forth of two sets of objects is animated by its singular focus on sensuous, subjective human praxis. So therefore, in turning our analytical attention to the gap between the objectified and ideological forms of life and knowledge, social reproduction qua method, I hope, offers a way of examining the excess inherent in the making of history and the constitution of society. And remember, I began this talk with excess by drawing on Bakhtin, and it's important for emancipatory features. And social reproduction of method thus helps us to examine this excess by demonstrating not only how subjective sensuous human praxis lives the capitalist life, but it also unlives the other lives that have been rendered impossible in the process of objectification and rigidification of capitalist life. That really speaks to Vish's opening statement about other ways of living, other ways of anti-capitalist ontologies and epistemologies. Because I feel like it is this unlived lives, that it is in this rigidification of the life that we are forced to survive, this excess is generated. And this excess is generated by the lives unlived and the one we are forced to survive. And it finds a contemporary expression in, at least for the book and for me, in embodied social relations. So that's where I will end. I think I've been about 30 minutes, Vish. I hope that was okay. And perhaps now we can open it up for some conversation.
Thank you. That was excellent. Yes. Lots of exciting sort of ideas and concepts and food for thought. It's open for engagement. Anybody who would like to go? Comments, questions, clarifications even.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Anybody? We have half an hour to spend with our guest. Okay. Well, if nobody wants to go, I'll just kind of step in there until people kind of gather their thoughts and so on. So, there's a juxtaposition also with liberalism, and you mentioned it. But maybe just to kind of broaden the ambit and remit of this conversation, liberalism's conception of the individual and the subject. And I mean, how does your kind of approach, your kind of sort of social reproduction core method approach, kind of takes us beyond liberalism? Maybe unpack that a little bit more for us. Yeah.
Thank you, Vish, because I think that really is the question. I feel like, well, first of all, of course, I understand liberalism to be the political philosophy of capitalism. So, in that, it is really a conceptualization of various forms of subjecthood within the capitalist philosophy of history, is what we call liberalism, or at least how I understand it. And in this understanding, I find that, because these days we are discussing it is neoliberalism, it is authoritarian liberalism, it is illiberalism. But I think in all its forms, it really is beholden to the reproduction of capitalist life as such. And whatever are the regimes of accumulation, what are the regimes of control under the capitalist, for us, the contemporary capitalism, is really then the thinking about the production of subjectivity. But I think in almost of its each iteration, it produces the subject as this coherent self-same thing, in that it has a certain life chances in the market, and an individual's is then indexed to the market in order to increase its life chances, rather than trying to understand the individual as being part of the making of the society as such. So, in other words, for liberalism, as I understand it, the subject is a second degree abstraction, in that it is, yes, it produces, it has a certain agency, but the agency is in the form of a constant doing, like the liberal politics. There's always something going on. We are dealing with the policy, we're trying to address things, but the very constitutive forms are not being questioned. And that constitutive form is the marketized form of life. So for me, then the question is, therefore, because I mean, as you know, a lot of people do critique Marxism as being the economically reductionist form, whereas for me, it really is liberalism is the economically reductionist one, in that it indexes one's being to one's life chances within the capitalist market. So if we were to go beyond this regulative scheme, because it is really about the regulation rather than the constitution, I feel like what Marxism does and what I'm trying to do is perhaps trying to find a way out. How do we go beyond the economic subsumption of life under capitalism to a conception and living of life that actually starts undoing? So that's why I, somewhere in the book, and taking my, again, cue mostly from the phenomenological Marxists, and I think Michel Henry actually uses this term somewhere, that economy is actually the ideological double of reality. So how do we then understand this ideological double of reality that is imposed on us, that we have to survive, that we have to always fight against this position, depending on where we are in society? So I think it is in that way, it is really trying to kind of go around and around that liberal form of thinking and see what are these openings, what are these excesses. And the reason why I focus on, say, gender, sexuality, race, ability, and so on, I think in these struggles, when people are asking the question, who am I? And trying to understand it sometimes within these terms, not necessarily in identitarian way, but trying to find a way of connecting to a past, to a future, these different forms of social relations start multiplying their own imaginaries. And
Mhm.
I'm trying to see which ones are actually going beyond that liberal market bound, that ideological double of life towards a more understanding of, a more genuine understanding of what I'm not. So in other words, I think we're not trying to make ourselves, we're not becoming what we are, but rather we're trying to exceed our own understanding within our relations and then seeing what kind of social organization is able to hold me and my relations that actually goes beyond the control of the market. So that's how I see my relationship to the kind of, political theory of capitalism.
Great. Any other takers that want to join the conversation, comments, and so on? If not, I just want to kind of get you to Warren, sorry, you had something here. But even if we accept the reduction of liberalism as a theory of capital, what then for true individual freedom and its pursuit from political and economic subjugation? Good question. Yeah, go for it.
Well, Warren, thank you. And that really is the way to, I think that's what I'm searching for. And I think you're absolutely right that the true individual freedom and its pursuit has been, I think, from the get-go, Marx's own occupation and preoccupation, trying to find out what that might look like. And of course, you also started with a version of liberalism that was perhaps a bit more freedom oriented than what we're experiencing today, especially considering what's going on. So, therefore, the point is really trying to see how what that subjugation is doing to us in reducing our own imaginary of our thinking. And that's why I think my relationship to intersectionality has been quite ambivalent in that it is not always when you start thinking of yourself in these different terms, it's not a guarantee that you're also thinking of yourself beyond a capitalist future, because we are really on the brink of extinction, even as species. So that really is a way of perhaps groping, however dimly, towards a kind of future that is not, that could be imagined beyond the market, so to speak.
So maybe you can tell us a little bit more about phenomenological Marxism, because your project is kind of located within that. It's kind of retrieving and recovering and so on in our contemporary context. So just for the benefit of all of us, I mean, I know there's Merleau-Ponty and there's Sartre. I don't know where you place Sartre and all of these people, but it'd be nice if you can just give us a bit of a background to kind of the intellectual sort of antecedents.
Oh, absolutely. Well, what is interesting for me is that you're absolutely right, Vish. A lot of people think about Merleau-Ponty for obvious reasons, because
Mm.
he's the phenomenologist extraordinaire, or, Sartre's engagement with existentialism and phenomenology. But for me, really, like, just, I mean, I, okay, just let me tell you, I'm also thinking about John O'Neill, who was making use of Merleau-Ponty to some extent. But I don't think there is much possibility in terms of politically speaking with Merleau-Ponty. In fact, I'm writing something on Merleau-Ponty's turn to liberalism and Weber. I mean, for someone who's absolutely brilliant, beyond no doubt, and much beyond my assessment of it, he is one of the greatest thinkers. But one thing I'm really having difficulty is that anyone who is having difficulties with socialism, with the limitations of it, and that's why you're doing the democratic Marxism, I suppose, suddenly like just going back to a really reactionary liberalism.
Mm.
So Merleau-Ponty had this turn from the terror of communism to suddenly a Weberian version of liberalism. And Weber himself politically is a very problematic person. And that limited political imagination is for me very problematic. That's why rather than turning to the more Western European phenomenologists,
Mm.
what I try to do is actually go back to a kind of Soviet, pre and post-Soviet phenomenology that was developed in the Bohemia region, people like Karel Košek, people like Enzo Paci, and Michel Henry, even though he's Western European. So I'm actually trying to find these more obscure now. And I think it really comes out of that kind of 60s, 70s humanist Marxism
Yeah.
that was really trying to understand the life within the limits of socialism. And I think that was a very productive place. But because of Cold War and other reasons, and I think phenomenology as a philosophical stream also has been very much against Marxism. But there was this moment in time in 60s and 70s, a lot of people, because of their own lived realities, lived political realities, was trying to draw on both resources. And in that, I think that's what I'm trying to recover. And that's rather than going to that more obvious direction, I'm trying to find them in these crevices of socialist history. And that's what I'm trying to look at. And why it is important for me is that tension between historical experience and the lived experience. We keep
Mm.
talking about lived experience as if it is available to us, right? Because I'm racialized, because I'm gendered, because I'm sexualized, suddenly I have the knowledge of it. But it is not the case. Knowledge as impression or knowledge as container are not the only two ways of understanding of knowledge, but rather I'm trying to keep that tension between the
Mm.
historical experience and lived experience, because neither historical experience nor lived experience can be for me understood on their own terms. They really need to be mediated one another. Something becomes experience, that which I lived, that which happened to me, that which I'm doing, becomes experience for me through the historical mediation of concepts. Then I recognize it as external to me, and then I internalize it. Rather than having this kind of truism that I'm always all at once understanding, race, gender, and sexuality by way of my being is a very problematic one. And I think we fall for either critiquing it because we are taking it to be the case, which was I'm trying to show in the book, therefore we are writing it off totally, or we're just looking at historical experience as if historical experience only generates the possibility of these experiences and itself is untouched by those possibilities itself. So in turning to phenomenological Marxism, not just phenomenology itself, I'm trying to have a way of talking about that constant tension.
Mm.
I think that's why I find it an exciting project. That, I don't want to just say, oh, something is, like just ideological, as if in the normal running of life, I have that sort of two planes, that of reality, that of ideology. Whereas I'm a lot more interested how are they morphed into one in
Mm.
response to a set of possibilities that are presented to me. I feel like
Mm.
Warren is saying something.
Yes, yes, yeah. And he
Um,
said it's here and here for me is the crux of the issues facing Marxism, the historical blind spot, the state as the site of ruling class control, not simply a tool or reflection of mode. This allows for not only appreciating the limitations of the base superstructure assertion, but that contextual forms of subjugation are not at all times reducible to economic relations. Yes, these then have quite dramatic impacts on political strategic choices in the pursuits of social change and individual freedom. Do you want to comment on that?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I'm on Warren in that. And I think again, it doesn't mean at all that the economy or the mode of production is not important, but rather how do we, I think he also and you used the conjuncture as well. Of course, we are all remembering Stuart Hall. How are these things are
Mm,
one another's articulation, so to speak. But of course, you know, like his famous definition of race, right? Like the mode of how classes lived is an interesting one in remembering that and remembering those different forms of subjugation that Warren talks about. But then if race is the mode in which classes lived, then can we actually think of class as the mode in which we experience these other social relations? Or how does the modality itself? I mean, it's a wonderful, pithy, and you know, like a great formulation. But then for me, the question is, what produces the modality itself, rather than one thing being the articulation or the mode of another, but how the modality itself is operating so that I should be seeing race as a form of a lived version of class. And can I actually think of class within similar terms, that it is the mode of living for a racialized, gendered, sexualized being? And what might that look like? And I'm going to have this conversation with Warren, and he says, if we have a broader definition of class, then, and
mm,
absolutely, power, means of production plus means of administration and control. And again, it is in some ways trying to understand class, yes, as a relation of private property and exploitation, but also, and that's what I was trying to do in the book, you know, a lot of people say that Marx says class is a social relation. I'm like, of course he does. But let's see what kind of social relation that he's talking about. And I look at three different things, like in the Capital Volume 1, Volume 3, and in one of the other texts. I forgot which one I was looking, but I'm trying to see actually how Marx is using this notion of social relation, because that is an important one for us to think or rethink class as a, perhaps not as an omnibus, not a bag that is, you know, just we put everything in, nor as this like very peculiar relationship of property, but that constant passage between these different forms and that moment of perhaps representation of our social relations. Because it is interesting, I used in my presentation, and I was taking it from Marx. Marx actually says that we stand in social relations rather than we are, because he also tries to keep that being we are, that really does not have any definition. And that probably is the definition of ourselves, in that in the making of history, we become what we're not, or what we have been, and what we will be. And all these different forms of becoming is something that we try to anticipate in relation to our possibilities of making and remaking of our lives. And that we seem to only understand it in economic terms, but of course, there's a capitalist fallacy that we have been introduced to. And then the point is, going back to that form Warren uses it, as that individual freedom and what it looks like. And could we speak of the individual and individual freedom when we are talking about a communist mode of production? I think we can. And I think that is probably the greatest that we might have a chance to experiencing what individuality might be. So I think that's why I'm trying to go with that whole kind of phenomenological Marxism project-ish.
So you start off with this idea of understanding the human, and of course your entry point for this is to engage with some versions of Marxist feminist social reproduction theory. But there is another blind spot in that framework, which is ecological relations. And so I'd like to get your perspective on this, because some readings of contemporary readings of Marx kind of take us back to his ecological foundations, Kohei Saito, Bellamy Foster and others, and a kind of ecological historical materialism. But even there may not be a sufficient appreciation that Marx understands the human as a socio-ecological being, and we're part of the web of life. There's some readings there of the economic and philosophical manuscripts, so that take us there. His premises around what constitutes the human. But I'd like to get your view on this. Yeah.
I'm not quite sure, I guess, because again, when I use human or when I use subject, I'm again, and that's the challenge, right? I'm not using it in that liberal conceptualization. And with Marx, it is really like nature, or like the organic body or the inorganic body, right? So in other words, I think when I say human, actually, I mean that relationship between nature and us. And it is really that sort of naturalist thinking that what we have become, sorry, is this constant negotiation between those two, and even saying two perhaps doesn't do justice to it, but it is that one process of transformation and the different forms of transformation in the making of history. So what I'm trying to do, I try to read, I try to keep up, partly because of the existential danger that we are in with the eco-socialist, eco-Marxist forms. But I think I'm still trying to think about that understanding of social relation. What ecology as social relation might mean for us is an important question for me. Because even in thinking more than human, and I think we should, even in thinking energy transformation, even in thinking the planetary concerns that we rightly have in this moment in history, I think nonetheless we are approaching it as a social relation. And again, social relation not in the sense of a speciesist conceit, but rather in the form of we participate in these things, not as we are, because we are not simply gregarious beings that are just like socializing, but what are the principles of our association? The forms of association and the ways that we associate, we come together, are really, I think, requiring us to think a lot broadly than the theoretically humanist conceit, but nonetheless requiring a human subject, because it is having its agency within those terms. But I think the question is, how do we conceptualize that agency that does not reduce itself to this particular experience, but an opening? I think some of them are trying to use the metabolism for that. But again, I don't know how much of this is. I think it opens up a certain space for thinking, but I think I remain a bit skeptical in terms of what that really means in terms of a political project for us to go forward. Yes, degrowth is probably something what we need, but then how do you organize the degrowth? Once, say, like within the context of racial capitalism, is a question that we still need to go back to. So in other words, I'm just trying to think what are the political and perhaps practical and pragmatic implications of those bodies of knowledge might be for us. And I think those conversations will be more and more helpful. And I know you're doing actually in your work some of those. So I'd be also happy to hear from you a bit.
Sure, but because of time, it's we've got 5 more minutes. I just want to check, is anyone else wanting to come in to the conversation? We'll be wrapping up in 5 minutes. If not, I just want to ask you about, you had a critique of the kind of Marxist feminisms you engaged. They imported, sort of intersectionality and particular conceptions, even of race and racial oppression. I just wanted to push you a little bit about, with your kind of reworking and reconstruct an approach around social reproduction as, qua method, how would you approach racial oppression and where would this kind of approach take us? If you can just unpack that a little bit.
Absolutely. I think where I would go is, and again, I think I just want to clarify one thing, that yes, it is a critique of Marxist feminism, but it is a critique of a Marxist feminist, an anti-racist Marxist critique of Marxist feminism. So that's why I was saying we cannot do away with the Marxist feminist concepts, because that's what we have in order to think about these embodied social relations. And in that, for instance, one Marxist thinker that I find very helpful, who also was my dissertation advisor, is Himani Banerjee. I feel like, and in the book, I'm referring to her work a lot because I think that she and actually her doctoral supervisor, Dorothy Smith, had really interesting ways of thinking about both gender for Dorothy and gender and race for Himani. So rather than understanding race as the fact of the worker's being, how do we think of race as the constitutive aspect of the worker's being is a question for me. So, in other words, the question is not that race is important because the racialized workers are the majority of workers and they are the ones doing the work. So, in other words, race is not coming into the equation because it is the accoutrement to the subjectivity, but rather it is the constitutive form of subjectivity itself. I.e., we cannot just think of it as this object or this objective fact, but rather a subjective relation of living for communities of racialized workers. And in that, I think that kind of understanding also opens it up to the variety of understanding of race within our own communities. Because we know that, like in, say, partly because I think I'm thinking in relation to North America and migration, but when you think of in relation to race and understanding of race in different parts of the world, and we know the historians of race thought about it in at least in 5 different ways, that it also takes us out of this very phenotypical recognition that is still bound to white supremacy understanding of the racial hierarchization, but it would take us to the racialization or racial formation as part of the social constitution of these relations. I think I just want to move the conversation from taking it as this objective fact from the subjective lived ingredient of these relations. I think because with those, we will just have the multiplicity of understanding it, therefore multiplicity of political responses to that.
Right. And so a structural approach to race is not enough. I think that's what I'm taking away from.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
This has been fantastic. It's been really rich and thought-provoking and insightful and so on. And we really, really appreciate your time, G. And I'm sure your audience has as well. We've recorded this and we'll be sharing it on our Google list, etc. We look forward to having you back. There's a 3-volume project here. So please keep us updated. I'm happy to host you as long as I'm at WITS on this platform to talk about your work and for us to learn from you and engage with you. So once again, a big thank you for your book and for your intellectual project.
Thank you so much for both the emancipatory futures and democratic Marxism. And I'm glad we have this platform to be able to engage. And I'm also looking forward to those engagements in the future.
Great. Take care, everybody, and thank
Okay,
you for
everyone. Okay, bye-bye.
coming.